to change tack slightly here, talking about the asymptomatic screening program that's being offered to businesses, and particularly I wanted to ask some questions to Professor Simpson, who seemed just turned the screen off, but I might bounce it through to Sarah, that's okay, which is, he's back, great. My question is, do you see, so this is where businesses, like I say, offered the ability to get lateral flow tests to offer their employees to do weekly or twice weekly testing. Do you see this as a health and safety at work measure, or a measure to control population levels of coronavirus? You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. My normally very good internet seems to be playing up this morning. This is primarily a measure to reduce transmission within the population, and particularly when more and more workplaces are opening up. As Sarah's sort of pointed out, COVID, the more and more we know about COVID, in a sense, simplistically, the more people you meet, the more people you get close to, the more chance you have of transmission. So anywhere where you're going to get increased numbers of human interactions, you've got concern that there is going to be, however well people behave, there is going to be increased transmission. So doing this in workplaces, and particularly going down to smaller workplaces and having systems whereby people can test in smaller workplaces, will allow you, particularly in lower prevalence rates, to restrict the amount of transmission going on in the population. The other thing on this is that as a proportion of the population who are vaccinated increases, which is an excellent thing, what you are going to tend to find are more discrete outbreaks, and what you would wish to do, particularly with illnesses, and long COVID's been mentioned, you really want to prevent as many people becoming ill as possible, and this is another way of doing that. In a sense, it will, and it's not for me to say, be to an extent a health and safety at work issue in that it's preventing transmission at work, but it is primarily a population and reduction of transmission effort.
Thank you for that clarification. The reason why I ask is that if I was a business owner, I would, and being offered these tests, the assumption that I would make, maybe incorrectly, would be that this would be something that I'm doing to protect my employees at work rather than managing overall population transmission. I see that there's nothing about this on some of this, the brief stuff I've gone through in terms of from HSE's perspective, talking about testing that I could find. Do you give any advice, Sarah, regarding businesses taking up asymptomatic screening in terms of where that fits in with their COVID-19 risk assessments?
I think the advice that we would have been and would still give to business at the moment is that although cooperation with wider public health control is important, if business is able to do that, because of the well understood issues that on any individual case by case basis, you can't assume that because you've had a negative test your work is necessarily actually negative, that we would therefore still expect the full range of social distancing, hand hygiene, and all of the other controls with which business is now familiar to still remain in place, so that this can't replace any of those other controls, because you can't be sure that your workforce are therefore all free of COVID and therefore don't need to follow those other basic controls. So our advice to business essentially is that this is a useful public health indicator, but it doesn't have a place in the risk assessment process, and you should still carry out the full social distancing, hygiene, and other controls, which we have seen really do help workplaces control transmission.
Thank you. And my final question, so both Professor Simpson and I are from careers where we've had to, as part of our employment T's and C's, be vaccinated against a range of illnesses, Hep B, rubella, ensure we've got immunity to chickenpox, etc. Have you had inquiries, or have you? What's your perspective, Sarah, on businesses which are considering making part of their terms and conditions to have COVID vaccinations?
I think it's really largely out with our principal area. It's an employment law issue. I think as you say, businesses have chosen and do choose in some other areas outside of COVID to require vaccination. That could be true for people who, for example, as part of their routine work, may have to travel abroad to countries that still require vaccination against particular diseases. So, I mean, it's something that a company can do within the overall scope of employment law, but it's not something that we've been directly involved in the wider debates on.
I mean, surely it's something that you, dare I say, maybe you should be involved in, because it's to do with health and safety at work in terms of employees. It's considerations about whether employees need to be protected with a vaccine given the exposure that they're getting into. And I mean, from a personal perspective, I think the debate in the health and social care sector, I think there's no debate really, because like I say, you know, as a previous healthcare worker, I'm used to having to have vaccinations, etc. But in other settings, which is I think where the debate's going in other workplaces, and we've heard, you know, particularly like plumbing, etc., this seems to be where the issues are. So does HSE not have a perspective at all on this?
Well, I'm saying we haven't taken a view at the moment. I think it's very complicated, and there's a complex series of issues out there, including whether or not moving to compulsion would actually drive overall the take-up of vaccination in wider society, or down through sort of fear and misunderstanding. So I think there's a very, very complicated series of issues that need to be carefully thought through before wider government reaches the final position on compulsion. Like you personally, I'm a fan of the vaccination and indeed have had my first shot. And, you know, I would encourage all colleagues and people in general to do that, because I think it's important. But I think it's also really, really important. And we've talked a little bit about some of the harder to reach communities, and we know that vaccine hesitancy is probably higher in some of those harder to reach communities. And I think we really need to think about what, and you know, so this is not primarily an HSE responsibility, but as society, we need to think about what is the best way to persuade the largest number of people that taking up the vaccine will be good for them, good for their families, and compulsion may or may not have a positive role to play in that.
Okay.
Can I just do one final quick question, Chair, if that's okay? And,
very quickly.
Yeah. What if an employer did a COVID-19 risk assessment and said that employees working in a certain area had to have a vaccination? What would be HSE's perspective on that as a risk assessment?
Well, I suppose what you might, I mean, I'm sorry, but I suppose the answer is it would depend on the quality of the risk assessment. It's impossible to answer what do you think about a risk assessment unless you could actually look at it and see why they reached that conclusion.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Sir Saxby.